The word dialectics with which we are concerned today generally appears to be a sort of a riddle or enigma to an uninitiated person. The word is generally associated with the name dialectical materialism, which is the materialist philosophical approach that distinguishes Marx and Engels, and following them Lenin and others, from other pre-Marxian materialists, whom Marx generally referred as old materialism. Now, the earlier materialism was, it is said, mechanical, whereas Marxian materialism, or the kind of materialism that Marx and Engels developed, was dialectical. This is a term, the name, that Marx and Engels themselves did not use. It was coined by Georgy Plekhanov, a Russian Marxist. As the term historical materialism, however, was coined by Engels himself. Be that as it may, the word dialectic, from which the adjective form is dialectical, is derived ultimately from the Greek word dialogo. Dialogo is a word which is known to English in the form of dialogue. Now, one misconception has to be kept out of mind. Dia does not mean two. So, dialogo or even dialogue does not mean the conversation between two persons. The conversation may take place between several persons, more than two. Dia means through. So, dialogo is through conversations, through words, or something to this effect. This is the first point to remember. There is not one or two, but several people involved in this discussion. Plato wrote a number of dialogues which, however, reflect the spirit of Plato's philosophy, though they are all ascribed to Socrates. Now, there are dialogues like Aeon, where there are only two speakers, Socrates and Aeon, a rhapsody, as a kind of Pathak Thakur, who would recite Homer's poetry. But there are also other dialogues like the Republic, where there are several characters, almost a dozen, and those people always converse, not all at a time, but between themselves, with Socrates at the center. So, the first point is this: dialogue means through words, through conversations. But the word dialectic, or in English dialectics, the spelling is different in different European languages. In German, for example, dialectic is written with K rather than C, whereas in English it's dialectics with C in both cases rather than K. Now, dialectics or dialectic is a word which nobody really understands. I mean, not exactly nobody, but most people don't really understand. But those who had heard of Hegel try to make out a kind of their own homemade understanding. They say it's all right, we know what is dialectics. On the one hand, there is a thesis, a point that is established, and on the other hand, there is antithesis, the point that is challenged. And out of a discussion between thesis and antithesis emerges synthesis, where the 2 points of view get merged into one. Nothing could be farther from the truth, from what Hegel meant by dialectics. Of course, these words occur in Hegel's writings, but seldom, if any, they occur at a time. Hegel did speak of thesis and antithesis, but synthesis does not mean, let me repeat, does not mean a kind of mixture of the two. It is a third category, and that is what Marx and Engels really aimed at. How, from the interaction of different forces, not necessarily two, but many, something emerges that no one wished, but everybody strove, fought to get the result he or she desired. In his study of history or the philosophy of history, this is what Marx and Engels emphasized all the time, that history is made by man, but not as man pleases. Humans are only the agents. They fight to draw the course in their favor, but what emerges is something that nobody really wished for. This is the best example of dialectics that can be given, where several, not two, forces interact or interpenetrate, and that is how something new emerges. What Hegel wanted to emphasize, and Marx and Engels also took it from him, that the world moves not linearly, not in a straight line, but in spirals. In spirals, that is, where several forces interact among themselves, and it is this interaction that makes history, nature, everything possible. Different forces, not two, but different forces that are contradictory to each other. And this is in fact what Hegel meant by the unity of the opposites. Engels, on the other hand, made it more expanded in the form of unity and struggle of the opposites. This of struggle was, of course, something that was not exactly necessary, but still he thought it better to place it after unity. And that is how the opposites, again not two, but many, or maybe two, but more than one, forces always go on working together, one opposed to the other. And that is how the struggle of the opposites is a reality. What Hegel emphasized, and that was his genius, was the unity of the opposites. What he said was something like this: whenever there is a case of giving, there also must be a case of receiving. So, giving and receiving together, though opposed to each other, constitute a whole. Without a recipient, there cannot be any giving, and without giving, there cannot be any recipient. And that is how Marx and Engels also developed it in wider fields. Marx mostly in the case of economics, Engels also in the case of nature. How the opposite forces unite and at the same time continue to oppose each other. This was the first principle, which goes against Aristotle's concept of logic. Now, what did Aristotle say? Aristotle formulated 3 laws of thought. Nowadays, we may not call it law, but that is how the people of the medieval times and later times understood it. The point Aristotle wanted to say is apparently, at least to a common man, very simple. If you refer to an object or an idea, let us call it X. Let it be an object like a flower or a fruit or a chair or a table, or it may be an idea like kindness, like modesty, Now, either way, when you refer to modesty, you mean modesty and nothing else. That is, X is always X. X means the same X under all circumstances under discussion. And that goes well for every other object on earth as also ideas. Hegel, on the other hand, emphasized the fact that X is not always X. X can be X and not X at the same time. This goes against the second law of Aristotle, the laws of thought. Aristotle wanted to emphasize there could be no middle. Either it is X or it is non-X. There cannot be anything between the two. That is why it is called the law of excluded middle. That is, either you are happy or you are not. Either you are kind or you are not. Either it is a flower or it is not. This was the clear-cut approach Aristotle emphasized. But Hegel said a flower can be a flower and not flower at the same time. That is, the flower will not remain a flower always. It will either die or turn into a fruit. Similarly, a happy man is not always happy. Even within his happiness, there might be, and there generally is, an element of unhappiness. So, happy and unhappy do not always cancel each other. They can coexist within the same person at the same time under the same circumstances. So, the idea of excluded middle is something that Hegel rejected, and Marx and Engels also followed him. First there was then the law of identity, X is X. Then there was the law of excluded middle. By excluding both, dialectics prefers to move in a new fashion. I call it a fashion, but not in the popular sense of the term. I mean the way, a new way in which opposite things are not only opposite, they are also united in their own way. Marx's study of British rule in India, two famous essays written in 1853, provide us with an excellent example. He shows that how the advent of the British had destroyed the rural society in India. The new industries that had cropped up, mostly the railways had helped it. Then there was the use of coal and other things, the import and export from other places. So the whole trade and commerce had brought a new look to Indian economy. And the role of the British rule was therefore destructive. But that is not the whole truth. In 1853, Marx was not very old and mature then. He was intelligent enough to point out that besides this destructive role, there is also a constructive aspect. It was because of this new advent of capitalism in India that education has spread, and the Hindu college, he did not refer to the Hindu college, but he referred to the educational institutions in Kolkata. Of course, it was then called Calcutta, and at Calcutta, not in Calcutta. Calcutta was then a very small area, and the population too was negligible. In a letter in this report, Marx pointed out that in Calcutta, although under very meager contributions, a new class of youth was growing up, fit to rule the country. And he expected that in some future, near or distant, India will be free either by the Indians themselves or by the fall of the capitalist rule in Britain, and that is how the history will develop. So, what Marx said may be summed up in the philosophical terms thus: nothing remains as it is, everything changes. So, what appears to be destructive will also in the long run prove constructive, and anything that shows to be opposite have also an element of unity in them. So, when we think of these laws of dialectic, laws of thought, we have to go back to one Greek philosopher called Heraclitus, a pre-Socratic philosopher, before the 5th century of the Common Era, before the Common Era. Now, Heraclitus said words also as in the terms of riddles, as if he was speaking something which could not mean anything other than nonsense in the apparent sense. For example, he said, you can't bathe twice in the same river. Apparently this is absurd. The Ganga or the Yamuna, the Kaveri or Krishna, in which a man bathes, is the same Kaveri, the same Krishna, the same Yamuna, the same Ganga, when he or she bathes there on the next day. But think a little deeply. With the passage of time, the passage of water too has moved far away from the Ganges to the sea. So with Ganga, so with Jamuna, everywhere the flow of water has not remained the same. So although one bathes apparently in the same river, the flow of water is not the same. This is the concept of dialectics, change, continuous change, and change being the only constant factor. The concept of dialectics also takes the form of a logic of change, a philosophy of change, both in history and in nature. This is the first point about dialectics we have to keep in mind.